To dig deeper into today's topic, we'll be talking with our expert, Deb Roy. Deb is Professor of Media Arts and Sciences at MIT, where he directs the MIT Center for Constructive Communication. He is Executive Director of the MIT Media Lab and co-founder and chair of Cortigo. Deb, what is misinformation in your words? And can you talk a little bit about one of the largest studies of fake news that your team conducted at MIT? What did you find? What were the implications?
Misinformation or disinformation, malinformation, there's a lot of different words flying around these days. I think some important kinds of information that are often being talked about include false information, things that are just not true. Other times, opinions that are stated as if they are fact when it's really just someone's opinion. It might also be that someone is just cherry picking and sharing partial truths and leaving important things out. And all of those, so whether it is just simply an untrue statement, an opinion stated as fact, or partial facts, it gets even more complicated because some people are purposefully sharing those kinds of information. So if you are purposefully saying something untrue, that's called a lie. So you're lying. But if you don't realize something is untrue and you share someone else's lie, maybe you're not lying anymore. You're just kind of unwittingly forwarding along something that's not true. So it's complicated, but those are some of the ways that when I think about the word misinformation, those all come to mind, and they're all, I think, important. I'd say one other thing, which is that's sort of looking at different kinds of information and saying what's misinformation. You could also say, well, why does all this matter? What are problems that end up in being in an information space where you have a lot of lies and partial truths and so on flying around? There you can look at the impacts on people and say, well, one bad outcome is a lot of people end up with false beliefs. They believe in the conspiracy theory and maybe they take actions based on that do themselves or others harm. Another kind of negative impact is a lot of people start getting so confused because they're hearing conflicting things. They're hearing multiple different theories or multiple different variants of what's going on, and they can't make sense. So we lose our confidence that the truth is even knowable. So we just end up in a state of doubt. That's bad and can be a great environment for an authoritarian to say, don't worry, I'll take care of things. Right. And then, a third kind of sort of harm to society is people end up turning on one another and saying, you know what, I hate that group. That group is sort of somehow less than me. So I think this kind of group on group dehumanization or even violence can be triggered by certain kinds of misinformation. So those are harms. Actually, sometimes it doesn't matter whether it's an opinion stated as a fact or it's cherry-picked truths. There are different ways in which you could trigger that kind of a reaction amongst people or that kind of impact. So I think it's complicated, but both looking at misinformation and also looking at the impacts are both important. In terms of our study that we published in Science, this was a study published in 2018. Our lab, this was Soroush Vosoughi, was the person who led this work in our group, working with Sinan Aral, another professor at the Sloan School, who was a collaborator and co-author of the paper. We did a study looking specifically at how contested news stories, so these are news stories that were published that a lot of people shared through social media, and then they were fact-checked by one of the sort of major fact-checking organizations. We looked at a number of organizations. And some of those stories ended up, after being fact-checked, to be true, and others turned out to be false. And so in the Science study, we built a very large collection of all of these stories that had been fact-checked by a number of major organizations and looked over time, over about a decade, pretty much all of Twitter's history, had access to Twitter data. And we looked at every time a story that was fact-checked was shared, we traced very carefully how that story was shared through retweets. And so, if I post a story and 2 followers retweet that story, and then several people retweet the retweets, you end up with what's called a cascade. It's kind of just a series of retweets. And you can actually create these pictures or sort of analyze these trees over time of how a story spreads, and then measure how big is a tree, how fast does it spread, how far does it spread. So there's various ways of measuring these cascades. So we asked a very simple question. If you take all of the true stories and look at their cascades and compare them to the false stories, are they different? And we found that there was actually stunning levels of difference. In general, the false stories traveled much further and much faster than the true story. So just as one example, if you looked at all the stories that reached at least 1,500 users on Twitter, the false stories reached those first 1,500 people 6 times faster than the true story. So it's not even close. It's like stunningly more advantage if the story is false. So that's disturbing, to say the least, that there seems to be this bias built into the network for spreading the stories that are not true. We looked at, are these bots or sort of automated algorithms? And as far as our analysis shows, this is really a large number of human beings that are deciding to retweet and share these stories in this kind of pattern. It's not bots that it was driving this pattern. And finally, we looked at the emotional responses that were encoded in how people were responding to these stories when they'd see them, in order to try to get some hints of why people would choose to share, on average, the stories that are false much quicker and much more often. And we found that, in particular, people expressed surprise and disgust much more often when they saw a story that turned out to be, after being fact-checked, turned out to be false. So it seems that, if one were to imagine a causal story, we couldn't determine for sure what the cause was, but a kind of consistent story is that basically in the moment you see the story, or maybe you don't even read it, you just read the headline. And if you have a certain level of surprise and disgust in what you're seeing, you're more likely to share that with your followers. And the false stories seem to have that response more often than the true ones, because maybe it's easier to be disgusting. And certainly it's easier to be surprising if you don't have to stick to the truth and you just make stuff up.
What I'm wondering is that, given that it was such a big study and it became really popular, did any of the tech companies actually react to the story itself, like Twitter, or did it add anything to their own algorithms or how they were doing stuff?
There's a group of researchers that, based on our paper, implemented some very interesting algorithms to try to predict, based on early spreading patterns, to try to flag stories that may turn out to be false. It's tricky business because you really need people to kind of read and research and interpret these stories. But just these sort of sharing patterns can at least give you some early warnings. That was one of the reasons we originally did the work. And I believe some of those ideas were actually brought into the Twitter platform to try to help deal with some of the issues. I wasn't on the inside, so I don't know the details, but I did talk to the team that built some of the algorithms based on our research. And they actually built a company which was then acquired by Twitter. So we do know that the platform is very worried about these issues and has been taking various measures to try to tamp down some of the problems.
That brings me to the next question, which is that, given the penetration of these social media companies around the world, where in some countries people don't know if they're using Facebook or the internet, and given their business models as well, a question that I've had is that, technically speaking, are these companies able to counter misinformation, the speed of the spread and the extent of the spread, a bit of a lost cause?
I think there are many things that are possible to improve the situation. If you go back to the answer I gave to your question, what is misinformation? The summary is it's complicated. There's a lot of different kinds of misinformation and a lot of different kinds of harms it can do to individuals and to society at large. So I don't think there's any one fix. That if Facebook just did this or Twitter just did that, we would, things would be better. So it is definitely complicated. I think it's important to notice that in these various platforms, and I'd include Instagram and TikTok and so forth, that there are, of course, billions of people on these platforms, but there are certain people, broadcasters, social influencers, who emerge as having much greater reach than the average user. And so a lot of the narratives, the conspiracy theories, the false information that tends to reach lots and lots of people are often being driven by relatively small numbers of influential sources, whether it's a professional publisher or just someone who is very good at the platform and gains a huge following. So I think that's really important just to notice that it's not like the majority of the false information or the problems are coming from billions of people. Billions of people are involved in seeing and sharing and responding to the content. But I think that's important, which is we should have more focus on the sources driving a lot of the influence. I think the platforms know who those sources are. It's very easy to measure reach and measure influence. So that's something that platforms know. I think there are certain things which are easy to measure in terms of impact of these, if you call these like broadcasters or influencers. How polarizing is this person's, when someone says something, does it really divide a group so that some people love what they hear, others hate what they hear? When someone speaks, does it generally cause people to say a lot of hateful things, racial slurs, whatever, right? Well, these are things that are actually pretty easy to monitor and measure if you're running the platform. But then the question is, well, what are the rules? Is it okay or is it not okay to say something hateful? We don't, on one hand, want policing of free speech. On the other, we don't want platforms to amplify hate and trigger violence. So some of these balancing acts, it's not just can the platform do something about it, do we want the platform to do something? And then who's the we? What's the kind of rules that we're able to set? So I think there are things like figuring out who is having the most influence, some ways to measure the kind of effects they're having. I think in some ways the hardest thing is then to decide on what are the rules we'd want to set, and is there the political will to, put regulations in place or put pressures on the platforms? These are some of the trickiest questions.
And I think that also just the post, right? Like you find out post the post after it's been posted and it's going viral. So the speed itself is an issue, right? Like even if you identify like a slew of accounts which tend to share misinformation and you've got some kind of way of monitoring them, but it's post the fact of something going viral, which creates the biggest problems with misinformation. Is that accurate, or do you have a different opinion?
No, you're absolutely right that these the spread of misinformation and the spread of rumors and again, I'll also mention sometimes it's not just that it's a rumor or it's a lie, something true and highly inflammatory that gets amplified far more than maybe as a society we believe it should. Someone attacks someone and that video of the attack gets seen by millions of people. Well, it was a bad attack, but it was just one attack. But if millions of people see it, it can have this amplification, outsized impact, where then people get angry at something, right, that is disproportionate to the actual event. So yes, misinformation travels fast, and we're often finding ourselves after the fact, post the spread of the information, wondering what we can do. But this is where I think it's important to notice that there are certain sources of content that are repeat offenders, where I think again it becomes the critical question is, what do we mean by good versus bad? And what does it mean then to be an offender, to do something bad? If we have a clear definition of that, then that's, question number one. Do we have agreement on what we mean by good and bad? If we do, then can we find the voices that are driving the most influence, that have the most reach, that are most active? Okay, then can we look at the history, the track record of each of those voices and say, on average, how offensive are they? Are they constantly offending or kind of going against what we consider to be acceptable behavior? And if so, well, you don't have to, you'll be less and less surprised every time something new is being spread by that source, because you say, there they go again, right? So if we have that kind of history, we can build up a sense of, well, listen, you've been a bad actor over and over and over, and so we're going to take away your ability to use this platform to continue doing what you're doing. That doesn't solve all the problems. Yes, someone can always, if you look at some posts or some pieces of content that go viral, the person who created that piece of content no one's ever heard of, and it's sort of it's like winning the lottery, right? The one thing you say goes viral and nothing ever again will go viral. It's just like that one thing. So there's always going to be that. And I just do not believe anyone can ever predict, that kind of virality. But then you have the people who have built up huge audiences. They have millions of followers, and they're just really, really good at saying things and putting things out that just get spread. That's where I think there's a lot that we can do to actually find people who are doing things that we consider good and figure out how to spread more of that and spread best practices, and where there's problems to be able to systematically identify and say, no, that's not, as a community, we do not find that acceptable. You can't keep spreading that clearly unverifiable rumor and asserting that it's true. Or no, you can't keep going and attacking that group and inciting hatred towards that group. That's not what this community wants, right? But is there a community when the community is, I don't know if it's Facebook, it's like billions of people. What's the community? You hear Facebook talk about the Facebook community. Is there a Facebook community? There's no one group that sort of all has a shared understanding of what good and bad is. So that becomes part of the problem for us, the people, and also for Facebook, that is serving many different communities.
That brings up the question of regulations. There's a lot of talk in the US right now, and European Union, other countries like China, India, which are more complex to discuss, I think, when it comes to misinformation. But there's a lot of talk there asking these companies to do something about misinformation, citing the harms, etc., in multiple hearings. Do you think anything's gonna come of it? Do you think these companies are going to reveal their algorithms as they're being asked here and there? What do you think is going to happen?
I don't know. I think it'd be silly to say that what's going to happen because there's so much uncertainty. But I think things are going to change. I think there's a growing understanding that I'll just say, in the United States, where I'm most familiar, there's a growing public recognition that things are broken. We don't like what we see. The platforms are recognizing that, and even publicly, Facebook has publicly said, we believe there should be new regulations, right? And so I think, if there's one thing we agree on, it's that things need to change. The problem is, I don't think anyone has confidence in saying, I have the solution for what needs to change. So I expect we're going to try stuff, and we're going to make mistakes, and we have to be in an experimental mode, because all of this is one grand experiment. The internet is an experiment, right? How old is the World Wide Web? It's like one human generation. It's been 25, something like that, years old. That's a blink of the eye, right, in terms of our history. And so it's just this completely new space that we're in. Of course, we've had this before, radio is new, television was new, et cetera. The internet is something different than these previous generations in that the properties of radio or the telegraph, if you want to go even further back, or television, telephone network, each of these had radical changes. They radically changed life, business and personal in every way they changed. But they were relatively stable in their properties. A telephone could transmit voice mainly between pairs of people. And yeah, you could do some conference calls. That was about it. Radio, one person who had a station and could reach people, in some area around them. And then we started getting national networks. So they were radical, but they took decades to really build out and have, kind of large scale influence. The internet also took quite a long time to build out, but then you can write a little bit of software and completely change the communication properties. So a couple of kids in a garage can say, you know what? I don't want those messages to stick around. I want them to disappear. You know what? I don't want messages with just text. I think I'm going to put audio. Hey, how about if we put some augmented reality so you can actually change your how you appear? All of this is just a matter of changing software, and rather than it taking years or decades to roll out a new communication system, you can roll out a new app in weeks, and it can spread in months and be a new layer. So that kind of fluid shift is really new for us. And so I think we are, this is one grand experiment, and nothing could be in some ways more fundamental than how we communicate in terms of our culture and our understanding of one another, our politics. So yes, I think there will be regulation. Will it help for platforms to tell us what their algorithms are going to do? I don't know. That's a pretty complicated thing to, even if you found a way to explain what your algorithms are going to do, which by the way are super complicated. So it's not like they can just say, okay, it's going to do this, right? These are these very complex systems where there are thousands of people who are turning knobs and tuning these complex machine learning systems. And it's not like one person sort of knows what the algorithm is going to do. So it's hard to, in the first place, describe how they work. Because they are based on machine learning. These are computers that are programming themselves, right? So they're getting more and more sophisticated, but also more and more difficult for anyone to explain what they do. And even if you could find certain ways to simply explain, here's the changes we're going to make to the algorithm. Well, what happens when you make that change and then you have a couple of billion people start behaving differently because of the changes? What are the results in terms of how we interact differently? Nobody knows. As far as I know, no one knows because it's so complicated. So I think having better dialogue, better transparency, more responsiveness from the platforms, more choices for individuals to say, I don't want that algorithm applied to me. I don't want that ad targeting. I don't want you to hyper target me just because you know all these details about me. Don't send me ads specifically based on that. I want to opt out of that. I think those kinds of things, of course, anyone can understand. We're not stupid. It's just the algorithms are difficult for any human to understand. So I don't know if algorithms and kind of showing your work at the algorithm level is the right level of transparency, but we can try.
So I think that the whole debate about Section 230 is this, that, hey, the internet is different from other broadcast mediums. But when I was looking at the history of mass media, and I've always seen these companies as, mass media technologies in some ways, right? Like they're interacting with humans. And historically speaking, there's been regulation at every period when a mass media technology was born. And I think that with the internet, the biggest argument is, oh, we can't treat it like a broadcaster. But at the end of the day, it is a mass media technology. And historically, they've always been regulated. And I think that in my head, this is that period which is happening where this mass media technology has popped up. It has been accessed by everyone. And now is this period has started where it has to be regulated.
Yeah, I mean, there's different kinds of regulations. So Section 230, in particular around the question of having kind of editorial control over the content. So I think more than mass media, a key question is, are there people in the organization that are deciding, let's publish this, let's not publish that? And then if you publish something which breaks a law, who do you hold accountable? So if I'm a newspaper and I publish a piece of content that is written by, letter to the editor, and I publish it, well, as the editor, I'm making a decision to put this in my paper and then amplify it. I'm going to push this out to many people. And if what's in that letter breaks the law, not only is the person who wrote it responsible, but as the human editor who decided to publish it, I'm also held responsible. And so the question is, if I am Google or Facebook and someone has written that letter and someone then posts that on Facebook, and so Facebook shows it to other people because they follow that person, or someone posts it on their website and someone searches a term and Google brings that piece of content up. The question is then, is that platform company responsible in the same way that a newspaper is? And the basic argument is no, because there's no human who looked at it and said, yes, I think I'll publish this. They're just automatically passing through the information. So Section 230, by the way, I'm not a legal expert. I've never read Section 230. So I should say I probably shouldn't even be answering any questions about Section 230. So I should just give that as a caveat and say this is just my non-expert understanding of it. But the non-expert understanding is that's the basic difference. The problem is that it's not so simple anymore, that with the advances of artificial intelligence and machine learning, now these platforms, the pipes used to be dumb in say Facebook or on a social network. It was just, I would connect to, the platform would connect to people and one person would post a message and the person who's connected would at a later time see it. And so if, early days of Twitter, if I followed you on Twitter and you tweeted, then your tweet would show up in my timeline, end of story. And if I didn't follow you, it wouldn't. So it was just creating this kind of switchboard. And now Twitter has a lot of artificial intelligence. The pipes are no longer dumb. They're not just, blindly pushing every tweet through to whoever follows. The pipes have gotten smart. And they're actually looking at the content, they're looking at how other people react to the content, and they're deciding what is Deb Roy most likely to be interested in seeing. And that is taken as an input into determining what shows up when I turn on my Twitter app. And so that intelligence starts to change the argument against Section 230 being an obvious, a kind of an obvious way to regulate. Or now the question is, well, if a company is developing algorithms, there's no human editor saying, yep, I'll show this tweet. Nope, I won't show this, right? It's a machine. But that machine's making decisions, and it seems to be smarter and smarter and more human-like in how it's making decisions. So at some point, you got to say, well, wait a minute. Okay, no, there's no human editor. But on the other hand, these are not dumb pipes. These are like really smart pipes. They keep getting smarter. So what do we do? Well, I guess, the basic observation I'd make is Section 230 was made by people. So maybe we should take a fresh look at it and think about what still makes sense and what doesn't, because the internet and all of these services are vastly different than when Section 230 was written. And we shouldn't just say things are frozen. We shouldn't also just say, oh, let's throw it all out. But maybe we do small experiments and start thinking about how to adapt.
That brings up the question of, like, apart from regulation, are there any other alternatives that we can explore or that are present that we could look into when it comes to the, extremely fast spread of misinformation? What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a lot we can do. We should be experimenting with new platforms. It's kind of hard to imagine that the big platforms that dominate today might be replaced or displaced by others. But it was also hard to imagine when Americans watched whatever 6-8 hours a day of television that anything would replace television. Now we spend more time, many people spend more time on social media than they do on television. And there was a time when MySpace felt like it was going to dominate. And now we kind of chuckle when we think about that. And we thought Yahoo would be the way that we would navigate the internet and find stuff. And now many kids don't even know what Yahoo is. So there's rollover, there's change. So how do we learn lessons from some of the problems we're dealing with and build new spaces? People tend to think every social network, every social platform has these problems, and they forget that LinkedIn has hundreds of millions of users and in general doesn't have these problems. So I think it's important to say, why is that? What is it about LinkedIn that is different? How did it scale and it continues to grow and not have the same problems? What can we learn from LinkedIn? And okay, LinkedIn is for work and it's kind of professional. So what's the LinkedIn for democracy? What's the LinkedIn for kind of civic life? Maybe the answer is something that hasn't been built yet, or maybe it's been built, it's just small and we need to grow it. So I think there's ways to think about new platforms. I think education is very important. There are many lessons we're still learning, and as we learn them, we need to learn how to convey them more effectively through, how kids learn, so they don't have to keep repeating all the mistakes that we're making. So there's many things that I think we can do to improve the situation.
Thank you, Deb, for your time and for explaining all these really important issues related to misinformation.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.